Okay, this part, I just feel it's necessary to discuss really briefly. It's called, I'm going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. So, I just want to exemplify biological concepts that are bigger than microbiology, but these concepts are influenced by microbes a lot. Microbes play important roles in these processes. So we're going to start with the carbon cycle. Okay, so there are several reactions that I want you to appreciate here. So first is reaction of photosynthesis. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit if you don't mind, okay? So it's not going to, I'm going to use more of a inorganic. So you've got inorganic carbon, right? That is converted into organic carbon in the reaction of carbon fixation. Now, look, I am being very cautious here. Why? We talked about photosynthesis just a little bit ago. Makes sense, right? But carbon fixation can happen not only in photosynthesis per se. Some carbon fixation does not imply use of oxygen, use of light. Does that make sense? Some photosynthetic processes do not result in oxygen production. In this case, photosynthesis is termed unoxygenic. My point is that you take inorganic carbon, whether it's CO2 or carbonate, basically it's oxidized form. Okay? And then you convert it to organic carbon, a reduced form. Does it make sense so far? Okay? That makes sense? And then I'm going to put carbon oxidation, you will see why. Well, let's say, well, you know what, let's call it broadly respiration. Respiration or respiration. Yeah, respiration's fine. That makes sense? Now, there are a couple of processes that I'm going to use as an illustration of both carbon fixation and respiration. So one of them is, so let's talk about carbon fixation first. One of them is photosynthesis. Okay? We talked about it already, right? So take CO2, you convert it to glucose, everybody's happy. Makes sense? And another process is not so innocuous. It's called methanogenesis. Okay, so you take carbon dioxide and you convert it into methane. The microorganisms called methanogens can do that. Are you following me? So why is that a problem? Well, if you think about it, when carbon dioxide by itself is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to the global warming, to the climate change. Does that make sense? Well, it turns out that although you're removing CO2 from the environment, by producing methane, methane is much more stronger greenhouse gas. So methanogens, of course inadvertently, they're not evil, they don't want to do that, but methanogens do contribute to the climate change, to the increasing concentration of methane through the increasing concentration of methane in the atmosphere, they increase the greenhouse effect. Okay? Now, respiration is a really broad term here, okay? So, two processes that we've already discussed. Okay, aerobic and anaerobic respiration, right? And then there are microorganisms that are called Methanotrophs. Those are fantastic, okay? So this is what they do. Check this out. They take methane and they convert it to organic compounds. It's not essentially respiration. I don't even know what to call it. It's probably akin. Well, it's kind of is because they use oxygen to oxidize methane. Does that make sense? But they don't oxidize it to CO2 and water. They convert methane into the organic compounds that and these organic compounds can be incorporated into bacterial cells. Are you following? So what they essentially do, they sequester the methane from the atmosphere. Are you following me? It's technically, like if we talk about the role of bacteria in climate change, methanogens contribute to it. Methanotrophs protect against it by sequestering methane from the atmosphere. Does that make sense? Now, the really, really big idea that I want you to see here first is that we cycle through two main forms of carbon. The oxidized form, which can be reduced into organic form. And this organic form can be oxidized into inorganic form, and it will be a cycle. Does that make sense? Now, to further illustrate this idea, we're going to talk about nitrogen cycle. So here I'm going to use actual formulas. This is not a chemistry class, so I'm going to give you like what you need to know, okay? What you need to understand. So we have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, 79%. Now nitrogen is extremely inert gas, but it is absolutely essential, nitrogen as an element, for biological molecules, right? Because where are you going to find nitrogen? Proteins and nucleic acids. That's your amino acids, that's your nitrogen bases, right? I'm not talking about carbon. Obviously, you're going to find carbon everywhere, right? So the first step to convert nitrogen as its inert form in the atmosphere into usable form is to reduce it. So first into the ammonia, and then you fix nitrogen into its reduced form in the proteins or nucleic acids. Does that make sense to you? So these steps is called ammonification. Make sense? We're good? Now when, animals die, plants die, living matter dies, this reduced nitrogen can be oxidized to nitrites and then eventually to nitrates. So this whole process, these two arrows, they are referred to as nitrification. Does it make sense? Now, to make it clear, yes, these nitrates can be, by some organisms in the soil, directly converted into this reduced ammonia. But what happens to nitrates, actually, in many cases, they are reduced to molecular nitrogen in the process of denitrification. Okay? Does that make sense? So, to kind of run it again, there are bacteria that can convert molecular nitrogen into reduced form, ammonia and organic reduced nitrogen. Then when tissues die, organisms die, this nitrogen will be oxidized in the process of nitrification to nitrites and nitrates. Now nitrates can be, by some organisms, converted into reduced nitrogen directly. But here's the thing. These nitrates, we use them as fertilizers in agriculture. Are you following me? Now the problem with nitrates is that in the spring, when water comes off the fields into the streams and lakes, it takes a lot of nitrates, a lot of fertilizer with it. Okay? And the abundance of nitrate in the water will promote the growth of all various microorganisms in the water, which will lead to blooms, including algal blooms. Are you following me? And it will lead to actually quick disruption of ecosystems. Okay? So in order to capture these nitrates, the agricultural runoff and all this wastewater goes into the wastewater plant. And in wastewater plant, there are microorganisms that carry out denitrification. It's actually a step. There's a layer of organisms through which water goes called Schmutzdecker, okay, which role is to denitrify nitrates. Does that make sense, this cycle? Are we clear? The very last bit, the very last bit here will be the sulfur cycle. And again, look, I'm showing you, this is the cycle between the reduced form and oxidized form. Reduced form and oxidized form. And same is going to be true for sulfur. So in the sulfur cycle, here's what you're going to see. Hydrogen sulfide can be used as the electron donor in various anaerobic conditions and can be eventually oxidized to sulfate. Okay? This will be weird anaerobic. Oh, it's actually respiration. Also, hydrogen sulfide can be used as the electron donor in anoxygenic photosynthesis. Forming molecular sulfur. And finally, now here's the deal. Remember we were talking about anaerobic respiration? Where you have glucose, all that kind of stuff. Remember that? This is what can happen. Another anaerobic respiratory process can use sulfate as the final electron acceptor, resulting in the generation of hydrogen sulfide. There are no specific names for these steps, but again, I want to highlight, you have reduced form, of oxidized form. You have reduced form, of oxidized form. You're cycling through reduction, oxidation. Does that make sense? Good? Questions here?
What was it that the hydrogen sulfide can make through the anoxygenic photosynthesis?
Oh, this one? This is sulfur, just molecular sulfur. Any questions on this one? Good?